Static hissed through the interstellar comms, smelling like copper and burnt plastic in the cramped listening posts of Earth. For 300 years, humanity swallowed its pride. We played nice. We let the Galactic Council dictate the borders, tax the trade routes, and treat us like uplifted apes. Then, a council peacekeeper crushed an 8-year-old human boy beneath its heavy treads during a routine compliance check on a border colony. They called it an acceptable margin of error. We called the ancient fleets. Dean Strickland rubbed his thumb over the cracked rim of a porcelain mug. The ceramic was cold, leaching what little warmth was left in his knuckles. Inside the mug, the coffee had formed a pale, oily skin over its dark surface. He hadn't taken a sip in 2 hours. The subterranean diplomatic hub of Geneva smelled of ozone, floor wax, and the stale sweat of panicked bureaucrats. Above him, a single fluorescent tube flickered, humming a persistent, grating note that felt like a drill against his temples. He was tired. The kind of tired that settled in the marrow and refused to be slept away. His joints ached with the memory of old gravity wells, his left knee throwing a dull, rhythmic throb into the cold air of the office. He stared at the blank wall opposite his desk, waiting for a reason to move. Footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. Heavy, uneven, the heavy blast door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Rachel Cobb stood in the threshold. Her trench coat was damp from the artificial rain of the upper levels, carrying the faint scent of wet wool and smog into the sterile room. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The rigid set of her jaw and the shallow, rapid rise of her chest told Dean everything he needed to know about the datapad, gripped in her white-knuckled hand. "They sent the official response," Rachel said. Her voice was flat, stripped of its usual sharp cadence. She stepped forward and dropped the datapad onto Dean's desk. The heavy glass screen hit the metal surface with a sharp, final clack. Dean didn't look at it. He looked at her hands. They were trembling, just a fraction, a micro-tremor she was trying desperately to suppress. "Tell me," Dean said, his voice a dry rasp. Rachel swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. Colony outpost on Kestrel 9. It was a standard council tax assessment. The planetary governor disputed the agricultural yield. The council sent a pacification strider to the town square to make a point. She paused. The hum of the fluorescent light seemed to grow louder. The crowd panicked, Rachel continued, her voice thinning out. People ran. A boy tripped. Leo Davies, 8 years old. He was caught in the crowd's wake. He fell in the street. Dean closed his eyes. The darkness behind his eyelids offered no relief. He could already picture the sleek, obsidian-plated legs of a council strider. They didn't walk. They glided with terrifying, hydraulic precision, unbothered by the terrain or the obstacles beneath them. "The strider didn't stop," Rachel whispered, the sound barely carrying over the hum of the ventilation. "Its sensors are absolute. It knew he was there. It registered his mass, his heart rate, his species, and it just kept walking. The council liaison called it a regrettable margin of error. Said the boy was illegally obstructing an imperial compliance path." Dean opened his eyes. He reached out and tapped the screen of the datapad. The holographic projector whirred to life, throwing a pale blue light across his weathered face. It was amateur footage, shaky and pixelated, recorded from a colonist's comlink. The audio was a chaotic mess of screaming static and thudding hydraulic steps. He watched the massive, multi-jointed leg of the strider descend. He saw the small, terrified figure in the dirt, wearing a bright yellow jacket that looked painfully out of place against the grey soil. He didn't look away. He forced himself to watch the exact moment the metal met the earth. There was no cinematic explosion, no heroic last stand. Just a sickening, wet crunch that the microphone picked up with horrifying clarity, followed by the agonizing, tearing sound of an entire crowd realizing what had just happened. The strider didn't even pause. Its pace remained perfectly, mathematically constant. Dean stabbed the power button. The hologram died. The silence in the room rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. Dean felt a strange, terrifying numbness spreading through his chest. It wasn't the fiery, righteous rage of a younger man. It was a cold, black vacuum. A realization that all the treaties, all the bowing, all the endless, humiliating compromises humanity had made to survive in a hostile galaxy amounted to absolutely nothing. They had spent 3 centuries castrating themselves to prove they were civilized, and the Council still saw them as insects. They offered compensation, Rachel said, her voice dripping with a sudden, venomous disgust. 300 standard credits, transferred directly to the parents' account, like they bumped a parked speeder. Dean slowly stood up. His knees popped, the sound echoing sharply. He walked over to the reinforced glass window that looked out over the cavernous, bustling floor of the diplomatic hub. Hundreds of desks, thousands of humans in cheap suits, pushing paper, analyzing trade laws, begging for scraps from a galactic table that would never have a seat for them. "Rachel," Dean said softly, his breath fogging the glass. "Do you remember why we signed the Sol Accords?" Rachel frowned, her brow furrowing. "Because they threatened orbital bombardment. Because we didn't have the shielding to survive a prolonged war against the Council fleets." "No," Dean said, turning his head to look at her. "We signed because we were terrified of what we would do if we fought back. We had just survived ourselves. We knew what total war looked like. The Council? They fight for territory, for economics, for pride. Humanity fights for extermination." He walked back to his desk, bypassed the diplomatic comms terminal, and opened a locked, physical drawer at the bottom of the cabinet. The hinges squealed, a sharp complaint against decades of disuse. Inside was a heavy, archaic analog phone. No wireless signals, no digital routing that the Council spies could intercept. Just a hard-line copper wire that ran deep into the bedrock of the planet, straight to a bunker that didn't officially exist. He picked up the receiver. The plastic was brittle and yellowed. "What are you doing?" Rachel asked, a note of genuine alarm bleeding into her voice. "Dean, if you bypass the UN..." "The UN died on Kestrel 9, Dean said flatly. He waited for the click on the other end of the line, the heavy breathing of an operator who had waited 30 years for a call they hoped would never come. "Directorate?" a gravelly voice answered. "Authorization code, Blackbird," Dean said. He tasted iron in his mouth. "Condition is absolute. Open the Mare Imbrium yards. Wake the dead." The line went silent for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, a single word. "Acknowledged." Vacuum has a smell if you know how to find it. When the airlock cycles and the residual atmosphere clings to your EVA suit, it smells like seared steak, hot metal, and spent gunpowder. Dean inhaled the scent as the primary airlock of Lunar Outpost 7 hissed open. The lack of gravity made his stomach pitch, a nauseating lurch that his inner ear hadn't experienced in over a decade. He grabbed the handrail, his thick, insulated gloves squeaking against the polished steel. Behind him, Rachel floated through the bulkhead, her face pale behind the curved visor of her helmet. She looked small inside the bulky suit, her eyes wide as she stared out the viewport. Beyond the reinforced glass lay the Mare Imbrium exclusion zone, the sea of showers. To the Council's orbital telescopes, it looked like a massive, jagged crater field, perpetually shadowed and rich in useless iron deposits. But the shadows were a trick of light-bending metamaterials, and the iron wasn't natural. Dean engaged his mag boots. Clack, clack. The heavy magnetic thuds reverberated through his suit as he walked toward the observation deck. He punched a sequence into a rusted terminal. The ancient machinery groaned, a deep, structural vibration that traveled through the deck plates and into his spine. The metamaterial cloak deactivated, rippling like oil on water, before dissolving completely into the blackness of space. Rachel gasped, the sound sharp and static-laced over the short-range comms, filling the massive crater. Tethered by thick, dusty umbilicals to the lunar rock was the fleet. There were no sleek, aerodynamic curves here, no elegant, glowing nacelles or polished silver hulls like the Council ships. These were brutish, ugly things, slabs of ablative armor bolted onto massive railgun spines. They were built like anvils, designed entirely around the philosophy of taking a beating that would atomize a lesser ship and delivering a payload that could crack a moon. There were hundreds of them. Silent, dark, and caked in decades of grey lunar dust. God, Rachel breathed. I thought they dismantled them. The history vid said they were broken down for colony habitats. We lied, Dean said, his voice stripped of emotion. You don't throw away a loaded gun when you move into a neighborhood full of wolves. You bury it in the yard. He led the way down the docking tube toward the flagship, the Goliath. The umbilical tunnel was freezing, the ambient temperature barely above absolute zero. Frost formed on the edges of Dean's visor. When they reached the manual airlock of the dreadnought, Dean had to use a heavy, physical crank to bleed the pressure in. The wheel shrieked, metal grinding against unlubricated metal. The physical exertion left him panting, his breath loud in his own ears. The inner door slid open with a violent shudder, kicking up a cloud of stagnant, stale air that smelled of old machine oil and preserved decay. They stepped into the dark. Dean unclipped his shoulder-mounted flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow, harsh cone through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the light. The bulkheads were scarred, bearing the physical memories of the unification wars. Burn marks, hastily patched hull breaches, exposed wiring hanging like dead veins from the ceiling. It feels like a tomb, Rachel said, her voice hushed, as if afraid of waking whatever ghosts still lingered in the metal. It is, Dean replied, his boots clanking heavily against the grated floor. We buried the worst parts of ourselves in these ships, the part of humanity that doesn't know when to stop, the part that built thermonuclear weapons before we built a cure for polio. They reached the bridge. It was a cramped, utilitarian space buried deep within the armored core of the ship. No windows, just banks of dead screens and manual toggle switches. Dean walked to the commander's chair. It was covered in a thick layer of dust. He didn't wipe it off. He just sat down, the old joints of the chair groaning in protest. He reached under the console, his fingers brushing against a hidden panel. He popped it open, revealing a simple, mechanical keyhole. He unzipped the neck of his suit, pulling out a heavy steel key he had worn on a chain around his neck for 20 years. It felt warm against his skin, a stark contrast to the freezing room. Rachel stepped up beside him, her hand hovering over his shoulder. "Dean," she said softly, the hesitation finally cracking through her professional veneer. "Once you turn that, there is no going back. The Council will see the energy spike. They will label us a rogue species. It's a death sentence." "A death sentence," Dean repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at the blank main screen, but he didn't see the dust. He saw a yellow jacket. He saw the cold, mechanical indifference of a boot coming down on an 8-year-old child. "They already handed down the sentence, Rachel. They just expected us to administer it ourselves, slowly, over centuries of subservience." He slid the key into the slot. The metal clicked, engaging the tumblers. "We tried to be what they wanted," Dean whispered. "We really did." He turned the key. For a long, agonizing second, nothing happened. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. Then, a deep, subsonic rumble began beneath their feet. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical pressure, a heartbeat starting deep within the belly of the ship as the cold fusion reactor was force-fed its first spark in decades. The floor vibrated. Dust cascaded from the ceiling in thick sheets. Above them, emergency lighting flickered, casting the bridge in a bloody, low-power red glow. The primary consoles whirred, fans screaming as they tried to push dead air through dusty heat sinks. Screens cracked to life, spitting out cascading lines of archaic green text. Reactor output, 10%, 40%, 80%. Life support, online, weapons array, spooling. The ship wasn't waking up gently. It was thrashing out of a coma, angry and starving for power. The noise grew deafening, a mechanical roar that shook Dean to his bones. "Comms are active," Rachel yelled over the noise, her hands flying over a rusted tactical terminal. She wiped a smudge of grease from her cheek, her eyes reflecting the crimson glow of the monitors. "Fleet telemetry is linking. Leviathan is online. Tartarus is online. Behemoth is online." Across the Mare Imbrium, the lunar surface began to tear itself apart. The physics of waking a dead fleet are brutal. Gravity has a memory, and it doesn't like to let go. From the observation deck of Outpost 7, the few remaining technicians watched in silent, terrified awe as the moon's crust fractured. The massive ships, deeply embedded in the regolith, fired their primary maneuvering thrusters. The silence of the lunar vacuum was absolute, but the visual violence was apocalyptic. Massive geysers of grey dust and pulverized rock exploded miles into the black sky, hanging suspended in the low gravity. Aboard the Goliath, Dean was slammed back into the synthetic gel of the command chair as the inertial dampeners struggled to compensate for a half-century of mechanical drift. The G-force felt like a concrete block resting on his chest. He bit the inside of his cheek, the sharp, metallic tang of blood flooding his mouth. "Main thrusters at maximum yield," Rachel called out, her voice tight, strained by the acceleration. "We are breaking lunar hold." The ship groaned, a horrific screech of tearing metal as the last of the restraining umbilicals snapped. The Goliath tore free from the moon, a massive slab of dark metal rising like a leviathan from the deep. All around them, the tactical display lit up with hundreds of green icons. Earth's ancient Deathworld fleet, a ghost story told to frighten new cadets, was airborne. "Atmosphere is stabilizing," Rachel said, tapping furiously on the glass. The red emergency lights finally flicked over to a harsh, unforgiving white. The smell in the bridge shifted from dead oil to the sharp, electric scent of ozone and burning dust. "We have a stable orbit. The fleet is forming up on our 6. Dean unbuckled his crash webbing and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His hands were steady now. The trembling was gone. The heavy, paralyzing weight of the last 24 hours had burned away, leaving behind a cold, crystalline focus. "Comms?" Dean asked. "Saturated," Rachel replied, pulling up a secondary screen. "Earth is losing its mind. The UN Directorate is screaming at us to power down. They're threatening to fire on us from the orbital defense platforms." Dean scoffed, a short, humorless sound. "Let them try. The platforms are armed with Council-sanctioned plasma lances. They'll barely scratch our ablative plating. What about the Council?" Rachel's fingers hesitated over the board. She swallowed, her throat dry. "We have an incoming priority transmission from the Council Oversight Station on the edge of the Sol system. Audio and visual. They are demanding an immediate explanation for the unauthorized energy spikes. "Put it on the main screen," Dean ordered. The static cleared, revealing the face of Councillor Vile. The alien was a tall, slender creature, its skin a pale, iridescent blue, draped in the luxurious, flowing silks of the central bureaucracy. Its eyes, deep pools of black, stared out with an expression of profound boredom mixed with mild irritation. "Unidentified Earth vessels," Vile's voice echoed through the bridge, translated into perfectly sterile, synthesized English. "You are in violation of the Solar Codes, Section 4, Paragraph 9. Unauthorized military mobilization is a Class A offense. Power down your primitive reactors immediately and prepare to be boarded for compliance processing, or you will be fired upon by the system guard." Dean stared at the alien. He looked at the smooth, unblemished skin, the arrogant tilt of the chin. He thought of a heavy metal tread coming down on a yellow jacket. "Counselor," Dean said, leaning into the comms pickup. His voice was low, carrying a dangerous, jagged edge. "This is Fleet Commander Strickland of the United Earth Armada." Vile's eyes narrowed slightly. "Commander, humanity is not permitted a standing armada. Your title is defunct. Your actions are currently being logged as an aggressive miscalculation. Stand down." "We aren't miscalculating anything," Dean said softly. "Yesterday your enforcers murdered an 8-year-old boy on Kestrel 9. You called it a margin of error. A tragic bureaucratic anomaly," Vile corrected smoothly, though a hint of condescension dripped from the synthesized words. Compensation was dispensed. If this tantrum is over a single, unfortunate casualty of progress, you are proving exactly why your species requires supervision. Turn your ships around. Primitive. Dean felt a cold smile stretch across his face. It didn't reach his eyes. "We are," Dean whispered. "We're turning them all around. Right at you." He reached out and severed the connection. The screen went black, cutting off the counselor's indignant reply. "Rachel," Dean said, the command tone locking into his voice like a steel vault closing. "Kill all external comms. I don't want a single broadcast leaving this fleet. Total radio silence. They don't get to hear us scream, and they don't get to hear us reason." "Comms blacked out," Rachel confirmed, her hands moving with practiced, robotic efficiency. The fear had finally burned out of her, replaced by the terrifying, infectious gravity of Dean's resolve. "Spool the slipspace drives," Dean ordered, watching the tactical overlay. Hundreds of ships were aligning, their massive prows turning slowly in the void, pointing toward the Council's inner sectors. "Coordinate jump vectors for the Kestrel system. We're going to pick up a body." The ship began to hum again. A higher, more frantic pitch. The slipspace drives, massive rings of condensed exotic matter housed deep in the engineering bays, began to spin. Looking out the forward monitors, Dean watched the fabric of space begin to warp. The stars stretched, their light bleeding into long, smeared lines of agonizing white. The visual distortion was nauseating. A tear in the physical universe right outside their window. "Drives at maximum capacity," Rachel shouted over the whine of the engines. "We have a lock. The fleet is ready." Dean sat back in the chair. He felt the cold ceramic of his coffee mug from hours ago, miles away, in another life. He felt the phantom pain in his knee. He felt the absolute, horrifying weight of what he was about to unleash upon a galaxy that had forgotten what human violence looked like. "Jump," Dean said. In utter silence, humanity's oldest nightmares tore a hole in the universe and vanished into the dark, carrying hell with them. Nausea hit first. Slipspace wasn't a smooth transition. It was a violent, unnatural tearing of physical laws that tasted like aluminum and smelled like raw ammonia. Dean gripped the armrests of his command chair until his knuckles turned bone white. The structural bulkheads of the Goliath shrieked, a high-pitched, metallic, agonizing wail as the dreadnought forced its immense mass through the dimensional aperture. Then, reality snapped back into place. The main view screen stopped warping. The blinding, smeared streaks of starlight coalesced back into hard, pinprick dots against the black void. Directly ahead hung Kestrel 9. It was a muted, agricultural sphere of dull greens and muddy browns, completely unremarkable except for the 3 sleek, silver slivers orbiting its northern hemisphere. Council pacification cruisers. They were beautiful ships, elegant curves, glowing azure impulse drives, and hulls polished to a mirror shine that reflected the local star. They looked like art. "We have mass shadows," Rachel reported, her voice tight, fighting the residual vertigo of the jump. "The entire fleet has dropped into real space. 312 vessels holding formation. The Council garrison is painting us with targeting sensors. They are confused, Dean. Their transponder logs don't have a classification for ships with this much mass. They're hailing us." A rough, grating voice echoed from the tactical pit below the command dais. Chief Tactical Officer Elias Cole leaned over his console, his thick fingers dancing across a physical keyboard. Cole was a relic, pulled from the same dark corner of the Directorate as the fleet itself. He had a face like a ruined quarry and smelled perpetually of cheap chewing tobacco and lithium grease. His left eye was a crude, cybernetic implant that whirred faintly when he blinked. "Put it through to my earpiece," Dean said, unwilling to let a council voice pollute his bridge again. Audio only. A sharp crackle of static popped in Dean's right ear, followed by a frantic, synthesized voice. "Unknown vessels, you have entered a restricted pacification zone. Your energy signatures are highly volatile and in violation of Council decree. Stand down your drives, or you will be eradicated. This is your only warning." Dean pulled the earpiece out and dropped it onto the metal deck. He crushed it beneath the heel of his mag boot. The plastic snapped with a satisfying sharp pop. "They're charging plasma lances," Elias grunted, his organic eye squinting at the archaic radar sweeps. "Shielding is going up. Standard Council energy dispersion fields. Cute." "Let them fire," Dean said softly. Rachel snapped her head toward him, her eyes wide. "Dean, we haven't tested the ablative armor against modern Council plasma in—" "Let them fire," Dean repeated, his voice dropping an octave, settling into a cold, terrifying calm. The silence on the bridge stretched tight enough to snap. On the screen, the 3 silver cruisers aligned. Their bows flared with blinding blue-white brilliance. 3 lances of superheated plasma, hot enough to melt standard Starship alloy into slag in microseconds, lanced across the void. They struck the Goliath perfectly amidships. The dreadnought shuddered. It was a heavy, dull vibration, like a freight train hitting a concrete wall. The bridge lighting flickered, and the temperature spiked by 10 degrees in a matter of seconds, bringing out the sour smell of ancient, scorched insulation. But the ship didn't break. The ablative armor, feet thick and designed specifically to absorb and shed extreme thermal energy, did exactly what it was built to do. Layers of carbon silicate boiled away into the vacuum, carrying the heat with them. The plasma lances guttered and died, leaving 3 glowing, angry red scars on the Goliath's hull. "Hull integrity at 94%, Elias announced, a slow, predatory grin splitting his scarred face. "Internal temperatures stabilizing. They just knocked the dust off us, Commander." Dean exhaled slowly. His chest ached. "Elias, teach them physics." "Gladly," the old tactician growled. He flipped 3 heavy safety covers on his console, revealing worn red toggle switches. Targeting locked, main railgun battery spooled, firing. There was no flashy light show. No elegant beams of colored energy. Just brute, archaic, terrifying kinetic force. The Goliath kicked backwards, the inertial dampeners screaming in protest as massive magnetic coils hurled a 3-ton tungsten slug at 4% the speed of light. In the vacuum of space, it was entirely invisible. Council energy shields were a marvel of engineering, designed to deflect plasma, dissipate lasers, and repulse ionic disruption. They were not designed to stop 3 tons of solid metal moving at a fraction of light speed. The physics didn't translate. The tungsten slug hit the center cruiser. The shield flashed violently for a microsecond before shattering like cheap glass. The impact was absolute. The elegant silver ship didn't just explode. It crumpled inward, instantly pulverized by the sheer kinetic trauma. Its reactor breached, creating a brief, expanding sphere of silent, brilliant fire that was immediately swallowed by the vacuum, leaving nothing but a cloud of tumbling, jagged shrapnel. The remaining 2 cruisers immediately broke formation, their elegant flight paths dissolving into a frantic, panicked scramble. "They're running," Rachel said, her hands trembling over her readouts. The raw, unmitigated violence of the kill had stolen the breath from her lungs. "Let them," Dean said, his eyes fixed on the expanding debris field. "I want them to tell the Council what they saw. Elias, hold the fleet in orbit. Rachel, prep my dropship. We're going down to the surface." Atmospheric entry in an old Mark IV drop shuttle felt like being trapped inside a metal trash can rolling down a jagged mountainside. The shuttle slammed through Kestrel 9's upper atmosphere, the heat shielding roaring as it chewed through the friction. Inside the cramped troop bay, the air was thick, smelling of vomit, nervous sweat, and the sharp, coppery tang of adrenaline. Dean sat strapped into the bulkhead, his jaw clenched, staring straight ahead. Beside him sat a squad of 12 Marines, hastily pulled from the Directorate's black site security detail. They wore heavy, matte black ballistic plating, clutching kinetic assault rifles. No lasers, no plasma cells, just heavy, brass-cased ammunition. They were quiet. The terrifying reality of the mandate had settled heavily on their shoulders. They had just initiated a war with a galaxy that outnumbered them 1,000,000 to 1. The shuttle jerked violently as the retros fired, throwing everyone against their harnesses. The roar of the thrusters shifted to a deep, vibrating hum, and then, with a bone-jarring thud that rattled Dean's teeth, they were down. The hydraulic ramp hissed, dropping open into the muggy, humid air of the colony. Dean unbuckled and stepped out. Kestrel 9 smelled like wet loam, crushed grass, and the bitter, chemical stench of the Council garrison's fear. The colony was a sprawling, low-tech settlement built around massive grain silos and hydroponic processing plants. The architecture was utilitarian, all prefab metal sheets and dirt roads. The square was empty. Dean walked forward, his boots sinking slightly into the soft red dirt. He unholstered his sidearm, a heavy, blocky revolver, but kept it pointed at the ground. Behind him, the Marines fanned out in a wide tactical arc, their rifles raised, sweeping the dusty alleyways and silent buildings. "Clear," the squad leader, a broad-shouldered woman named Miller, muttered over the short-range comms. Dean looked around. The colonists were here. He could feel their eyes. He saw the subtle twitch of curtains in the prefab hab blocks, the pale faces pressed into the shadows. They weren't cheering for their saviors. They were terrified. They had lived under the heel of the Council for generations, learning to keep their heads down, to pay their taxes, to survive. Now, a nightmare fleet had blotted out their sky, raining shattered metal down upon their oppressors. "Commander." Elias's voice crackled over Dean's earpiece, heavily distorted by the atmospheric interference. Orbital scans show the Council ground garrison is barricaded in the governor's mansion on the North Ridge. They're pinging distress signals on every frequency. "Ignore them," Dean said, his voice raspy. He swallowed, his throat parched. "That's not why we came down here." He kept walking toward the center of the town square. The dirt road here was wider, packed hard by agricultural machinery. And then he saw it. The physical path of the pacification strider. It was unmistakable. Massive, diamond-shaped indentations pressed deep into the earth, spaced exactly 12 feet apart. Mathematical. Perfect. Unyielding. Dean followed the tracks, his heart hammering a slow, painful rhythm against his ribs. He found the spot near a rusted water reclamation unit. The local authorities hadn't even been permitted to clean the site. Council law mandated that any area involving a compliance casualty be left untouched for 3 planetary rotations for official documentation. Dean stopped. His breath caught in his throat. There was a crushed, bright yellow jacket, half buried in the blood-soaked dirt. It looked so impossibly small. It wasn't a sterile hologram anymore. It was real. The air smelled of iron and dried mud. Beside the jacket lay a shattered plastic toy, a cheap, brightly colored model of a starship. Dean dropped to his knees. The cold mud seeped through the fabric of his trousers, but he didn't care. He stared at the yellow jacket. He thought of his own son, grown and gone, lost to the bureaucratic machinery of Earth's endless compromises. His hands shook as he reached out, his thick, calloused fingers hovering over the stained fabric. It felt profoundly wrong to touch it, a violation of a sacred, terrible space. But leaving it here in the dirt, a monument to alien indifference, was worse. Gently, clumsily, Dean began to dig into the dirt with his bare hands, the soil packed beneath his fingernails. He felt a hot, burning sting behind his eyes, a violent surge of grief and rage that he choked back down into his chest. This was not a hero's mission. There was no glory here in the mud, just the ugly, pathetic remnants of a murdered child. Miller stepped up beside him. The tough Marine didn't say a word. She slung her rifle over her shoulder and dropped to her knees in the dirt next to Dean. She began to dig with her hands, too. One by one, the security detail lowered their weapons. 12 armored Marines knelt in the dirt of a forgotten agri-world, their hands black with mud, carefully and silently working to unearth the margin of error the Council had left behind. "We have him," Dean whispered, his voice cracking. He carefully gathered the small, broken form, wrapped in the yellow jacket, into his arms. The boy weighed almost nothing. Dean stood up, his knees trembling under the sudden, immense weight of his own humanity. He held the child tight against his chest, the blood and dirt smearing across his tactical vest. "Elias," Dean keyed his comms, his voice wet but steady. "Here, Commander," the tactician replied softly. "We have the boy. We're coming home." Dean turned back toward the shuttle, his boots dragging in the earth. "When we clear the atmosphere, open a system-wide broadcast channel. I want every council outpost, every listening station, and every terrified bureaucrat in the sector to hear me." "What's the message, sir?" Dean looked down at the bright yellow fabric in his arms. He felt the cold wind of Kestrel 9 blowing across his face, smelling of rain and incoming fire. "Tell them the solar cords are void," Dean said, his voice hard as iron. "Tell them humanity is no longer compliant." Antiseptic fog rolled out of the stasis pod, biting at Dean's wrists as he lowered the small, unwashed body into the chamber. The medical bay of the Goliath had not been used in 40 years. It smelled of brittle rubber, ozone, and a pervasive chemical freezer burn that clung to the back of the throat. Dean didn't clean the dirt from Leo Davies's face. He didn't brush the matted hair from the boy's forehead. He left the ruined yellow jacket exactly as it was. To clean him would be to sanitize the crime, and Dean needed the universe to see the ugly, muddy reality of what they had done. He stepped back as the thick glass lid hissed shut, locking with a heavy, magnetic clank. Frost immediately began to bloom across the surface, obscuring the child in a hazy, white shroud. Dean stood there for a long time. His hands were still coated in Kestrel 9's soil. His knees ached. His stomach churned with a sudden, violent wave of nausea, acidic and hot. He leaned over a stainless steel basin, gripping the edges until his fingers cramped. But nothing came up. He was hollowed out, running on nothing but caffeine, adrenaline, and a localized grief that was rapidly metastasizing into galactic terror. He wasn't a savior. He was a tired old man who had just struck a match in a powder magazine. Billions of humans lived under the Council's thumb. Billions might burn for this. The internal contradiction tore at him. He was willing to sacrifice the many to avenge the one. A mathematics of pure human irrationality that the alien bureaucrats would never comprehend. "Commander!" Rachel's voice came over the overhead speaker, crackling through the degraded copper wiring. "System-wide broadcast network is patched. We overrode the local hypercom relays. You have an open channel to the entire sector, audio and visual." Dean wiped his mouth with the back of his dirty hand. "On my way." The walk back to the bridge felt like wading through wet cement. The ship vibrated constantly, a low-frequency hum from the slipspace drives cycling in standby mode. When he entered the command center, Elias and Rachel turned to look at him. They saw the mud on his hands and the dried blood smeared across his tactical vest. Neither said a word. Elias quietly tapped a sequence into his console and gave a short, curt nod. A red light blinked on the main camera array above the view screen. Dean didn't stand tall. He didn't strike a heroic pose. He collapsed heavily into the command chair, the ancient springs groaning beneath him. He looked directly into the lens, his eyes bloodshot, the deep lines of his face cast in harsh shadows by the bridge's utilitarian lighting. "My name is Dean Strickland," he began. His voice was raw, lacking the polished cadence of the diplomats in Geneva. "I am speaking on behalf of the Directorate of Earth. For 300 years, humanity has paid your taxes. We have restricted our expansion. We dismantled our militaries. We bowed our heads and allowed the Galactic Council to treat us like an infestation that needed to be managed." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, holding his dirt-caked hands up to the camera. "Yesterday, your management required the murder of an 8-year-old boy. You called it a margin of error. You gave his parents 300 credits." Dean swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat clicking audibly over the microphone. "You think you understand us because you read our ledgers and audit our crop yields. You don't. You forced us to hide the worst parts of ourselves just to sit at your table. But we kept the receipts. We kept the ships we built when we were a species that specialized in killing each other. The Soul Accords are void. We are no longer compliant. If you send your striders, your tax collectors, or your peacekeepers into human space, we will not file a grievance." He stared into the red light, his expression going completely dead. "We will kill them. We will burn your ships. We will crack your pristine stations to dust. Do not test us. You will not survive the margin of error." Dean dragged a finger across his throat. Elias slammed a fist down on a red lever, severing the feed. The silence that followed was suffocating. Rachel sat frozen, staring at her monitors as the telemetry data began to roll in. "Message transmitted," Rachel whispered. "It's echoing off the relays. It's bouncing to the core worlds. Earth's UN channel is flooding us. They are demanding we surrender. They are trying to give the Council our override codes." "They don't have the codes," Elias grunted, spitting a thick wad of brown tobacco juice into a metal cup. "They scrubbed our existence to appease the blue bloods. You can't override a ghost." Dean closed his eyes, the fatigue finally threatening to pull him under. "Let the UN scream. They'll figure out they're on our side when the Council stops taking their calls." Before Dean could open his eyes, the deck plates beneath his boots lurched violently. "Slip space ruptures!" Rachel shouted, her voice jumping an octave in sheer panic. "Multiple signatures dropping into kestrel space. It's not a garrison, Dean. It's a pacification armada." Sirens did not wail on the Goliath. They ground out a mechanical, gut-wrenching klaxon that sounded like two sheets of rusted metal scraping together. Dean's eyes snapped open. The fatigue vanished, vaporized by a cold spike of pure survival instinct. He gripped the arms of his chair, watching the tactical display flood with hostile red contacts. "Numbers," Dean barked, his voice cutting through the klaxon. 42 capital ships, flanked by dozens of support frigates," Rachel reported, her fingers blurring across the mechanical keys. "Sleek signatures, heavy plasma batteries. It's the 7th Vanguard. They must have been patrolling the inner transit lanes." On the main view screen, the Council fleet materialized. They were terrifyingly beautiful, formations of pristine, needle-like vessels, their hulls gleaming silver and white, leaving trails of azure Cherenkov radiation as their engines synchronized. They moved with the mathematical precision of a synchronized swimmer, every ship in perfect alignment. "They're broadcasting an open channel," Elias said, his organic eye squinting against the glare of the monitors. "No demands, no ultimatums. They're just painting us with targeting lasers. They intend to execute us on sight." "Standard Council doctrine," Dean muttered. "Overwhelming force to prevent a protracted conflict. They want to turn us to glass before the rest of the galaxy realizes we threw a punch." He looked at the formation of ancient, blocky human ships holding orbit around Kestrel 9. They were ugly, grey slabs of iron, radiating heat and leaking archaic radio noise. "Elias," Dean said, his tone dropping into a deadly, quiet register. "Break their formation. Engage the flak screens." Elias smiled. It was a terrible, jagged thing. "Aye, Commander. Dumping the trash." The human fleet did not possess elegant energy shields to absorb incoming fire, nor did they have precision lasers to snipe weak points. They relied on a much older, uglier philosophy of war. Make the space between us too hostile to cross. From the broadsides of 300 human dreadnoughts, thousands of physical hatches blew open. They didn't fire missiles. They fired shipping containers packed with raw, unrefined heavy metals, tungsten ball bearings, and unstable fission cores. "Detonate!" Elias roared, slamming a heavy brass button on his console. Space between the two fleets erupted. There was no sound, only blinding, staggered flashes of white light as the fission cores detonated, vaporizing the metal containers. A massive, expanding cloud of hypervelocity shrapnel and localized dirty radiation choked the vacuum. The Council fleet, moving at high tactical speed, slammed directly into the debris field. Council energy shields were built to deflect cohesive thermal energy and ionic beams. They were entirely unprepared for billions of jagged radioactive metal fragments moving at hypersonic speeds. The shields flashed a brilliant, agonizing purple, trying to calculate the mass of the threat, and then collapsed under the sheer, chaotic volume of kinetic impacts. On the screen, Dean watched as 3 of the pristine silver cruisers were shredded. Their mirrored hulls were chewed apart, venting atmosphere and blue plasma into the void. One of the ships broke entirely in half, its elegant spine snapped by a chunk of irradiated iron the size of a city bus. "Shields are down on their vanguard," Rachel yelled, a manic edge of disbelief bleeding into her voice. "They're breaking formation. They're trying to reroute around the flak cloud. They're treating this like a duel," Dean said, leaning forward, the straps of his harness biting into his shoulders. "This isn't a duel. It's a bar fight. Elias, close the distance, ramming speed." The Goliath lurched forward. The massive chemical thrusters burned with such ferocity that the temperature on the bridge spiked another 10 degrees. The air tasted of burning rubber and stale sweat. Dean was shoved deep into the gel padding of his chair, his vision blurring slightly at the edges from the sustained G-force. "Incoming plasma fire," Rachel warned. The surviving council ships retaliated. Thick, blinding beams of superheated plasma lanced through the flak cloud, striking the human dreadnoughts. The Goliath took 2 direct hits to the port bow. The impact sounded like thunder echoing inside a tin can. Dean felt the shockwave rattle his teeth. Warnings screamed across Elias's board as layers of ablative armor boiled away, leaving glowing, molten craters on the ship's hull. "Armor holding," Elias shouted over the din, frantically rerouting coolant to the outer hull. Port side took a beating, but we're still airtight. We're inside their minimum firing range. "Fire everything," Dean ordered. At a range of less than 10 kilometers, point blank in naval combat, the Goliath unleashed its broadsides. Massive rail guns, originally designed to crack lunar asteroids, fired solid slugs of depleted uranium. The recoil shook the dreadnought so violently that a secondary overhead monitor tore loose from its mount, crashing onto the deck and showering sparks over Rachel's station. She didn't even flinch, her hands moving frantically to isolate the electrical fire. The kinetic rounds tore through the Council flagship. There was no resistance. The elegant, curved hull was pierced instantly, the heavy slugs blowing massive, jagged exit wounds through the ship's reactor core. The flagship detonated in a silent, expanding sphere of blue fire, completely obliterated by a weapon so primitive the Council had deleted it from their threat databases centuries ago. All around them, the ugly, brute force mechanics of humanity were tearing the elegant geometry of the alien armada apart. Human ships took horrific damage, plasma scoring deep into their iron bones, thrusters failing, ancient bulkheads buckling. But they didn't stop. They rammed, they fired unguided kinetic torpedoes, they dragged the Council elite down into the mud with them. Dean watched the massacre on the main screen, his face an emotionless mask. He smelled the smoke filling his bridge. He tasted the copper of his own bitten tongue. He felt no triumph, no righteous vindication. He just felt tired. "Commander," Rachel gasped, choking on the acrid smoke filling the room. "The remaining Council ships, they're spooling their slipspace drives. They're routing power from their weapons to run." "Let them," Dean said, unbuckling his harness. His legs shook as he stood up, the adrenaline finally crashing, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. "They have our message." Smoke hung in the air of the bridge, thick and caustic, smelling of melted polymer and vaporized coolant. It stung the eyes and coated the back of the throat with a bitter, metallic film. The deafening roar of the close-quarters engagement had vanished, replaced by the ragged, wheezing hum of the Goliath's overtaxed life support scrubbers. Dean stood over the tactical plotting table. His left hand gripped the brass rail so tightly his knuckles ached, the only thing keeping his exhausted legs from giving out. The screen below him was a mess of overlapping icons. No more pristine silver slivers, just jagged, drifting fields of Council wreckage, slowly cooling in the hard vacuum of kestrel space. "Damage report," Dean rasped, coughing into his fist. He tasted ash. Elias leaned back in his chair, wiping a slow trickle of dark blood from his temple. The older man's cybernetic eye was whirring erratically, emitting a faint, high-pitched whine that set Dean's teeth on edge. "The Goliath is venting atmosphere in sections 4 through 9, Elias grunted, tapping a cracked screen with a thick, grease-stained finger. "Ablative plating on the port side is entirely gone. We took a secondary plasma wash that melted the outer bulkhead down to the structural ribs. If they had sneezed on us one more time, we'd be a cloud of irradiated vapor. Main railgun coils need at least 12 hours to cool before we can even think about spooling them again." "And the fleet?" Dean asked, dreading the answer. He didn't look up from the table. Rachel's fingers moved sluggishly over her keyboard. The adrenaline crash was hitting her hard, leaving her skin pale and her movements jerky. "We lost 14 capital ships, Tartarus, Invictus, Saul's Hammer. They're gone, Dean. Total reactor breaches. 22 more are severely crippled, dead in the water. They're running on emergency batteries." Dean closed his eyes. The math of war was a cold, brutal thing. 14 dreadnoughts, over 8,000 human lives, snuffed out in less than 10 minutes of chaotic, point-blank violence. "Casualties across the surviving fleet are still rolling in," Rachel continued, her voice trembling slightly. "Medical bays are overwhelmed. We don't have the synthetic skin or the burn gels to handle plasma injuries on this scale. Tell them to cannibalize the medical supplies from the downed ships," Dean ordered flatly. He opened his eyes, forcing himself to look at the casualty counter ticking upward in the corner of the screen. "Send EVA recovery teams out into the debris field. If a human ship has a breathable compartment left, I want it cracked open and the survivors pulled out. Leave the Council escape pods. They can choke." Elias spat a wad of brown tobacco into his cup, the sound wet and loud in the tense quiet of the bridge. "That's a heavy butcher's bill for one day, Commander. The blue bloods aren't used to getting punched in the mouth, but they'll recover. They have shipyards that span entire solar systems. We just played our only hand." "It wasn't our only hand," Dean said softly, walking over to the reinforced viewport. Outside, the darkness was littered with the glowing orange embers of burning ships. The flak cloud they had deployed still drifted aimlessly, a deadly hazard of radioactive iron and shattered glass. It was beautiful in a terrifying, apocalyptic way. It looked like a graveyard. It looked like home. "We didn't come here to win a war of attrition, Elias," Dean said, resting his forehead against the cold glass. The vibration of the crippled ship hummed through his skull. "We came to show them that the cost of doing business has gone up. They rely on clean statistical dominance. We just showed them mud and blood." Footsteps echoed from the rear of the bridge. Heavy, dragging boots. Miller, the Marine squad leader, stepped through the blasted security doors. Her matte black armor was scorched. A jagged groove melted into her left shoulder pauldron. She carried her helmet under her arm. She smelled heavily of burnt ozone and copper. "Commander," Miller said, her voice hoarse. "Fires in the lower decks are contained. We had to seal Engineering Bay 3. 4 men were trapped inside when the atmospheric bulkheads dropped." Dean turned to face her. He saw the fatigue in her eyes, the dark, haunted hollows of someone who had just listened to her people suffocate to save the rest of the ship. "I'm sorry, Sergeant," Dean said. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell her their sacrifice was noble. It was just a brutal, ugly necessity. "They knew the job when they walked onto this ship, sir," Miller replied, her jaw tightening. "But the crew is asking questions. They want to know if we're turning back, if we're retreating to Earth to resupply." Rachel looked up from her console, her eyes wide. "Dean, we have to. We don't have the munitions for another engagement. The Goliath is barely holding together." Dean looked at the 3 of them, the scarred tactician, the terrified communications officer, the exhausted Marine. They represented the entirety of humanity's broken, bloody resolve. "If we go back to Earth," Dean said, his voice dropping into a heavy, gravelly cadence, "the Council will follow us. They won't send an oversight committee. They'll send a sterilization fleet. They will glass Geneva. They will boil the oceans. And they will tell the rest of the galaxy it was a necessary pest control measure." He walked back to the center of the room. The pain in his knee flared, a sharp, stabbing reminder of his own physical limitations. "We are not going home. Ever." The comms array crackled, a sharp hiss of static that sliced through the heavy silence of the bridge. "Incoming transmission from the Sol system," Rachel announced, her hands hovering over the board. "It's a priority override from the UN Directorate. High encryption. They're bypassing the automated blocks." Dean sighed, a long, rattling exhale. "Put it on audio. I don't want to look at them." A voice filled the room. It was polished, smooth, and laced with barely contained panic. "Commander Strickland, this is the office of the Secretary General. We have intercepted the telemetry from Kestrel 9. You have committed an unprovoked act of terrorism against a Council Vanguard fleet. You are hereby ordered to power down all weapons, surrender your vessels, and submit to immediate Council judgment. If you do not comply, Earth will officially disavow you. You will be branded rogue insurgents. We will not burn for your madness, Dean." Dean stared at the speaker grill on the ceiling. He pictured the panicked bureaucrats in their clean, underground bunkers, desperately trying to put the leash back on a dog they had beaten for centuries. "Record a response, Rachel," Dean said softly. He cleared his throat. It tasted like iron. "Secretary General, you cannot disavow a fleet that does not exist. We are not terrorists. We are the margin of error." Dean leaned over the console, staring at the flashing green recording light. "Fortify the orbital platforms. Dig deep. The Council is going to bleed us. But they are going to have to hunt us first. We are cutting all ties. Do not contact this fleet again. And if a Council liaison ever sets foot in Geneva again, you tell them exactly what they saw today." He dragged a thumb across his throat. "End transmission. Black out the array, Rachel. Purge the nav computers of all coordinates leading back to Sol." Rachel hesitated for a fraction of a second. Deleting the nav data meant severing the cord completely. It meant stranding 300 crippled dreadnoughts in hostile territory with no safe harbor. She swallowed hard, nodded, and slammed her hand down on the purge command. "Nav data wiped," she whispered. "We're ghosts, Dean." "Elias," Dean said, turning to the tactical station. "Gather the survivors. Form up a vanguard of whatever ships can still maintain a slipspace bubble. Hook the crippled dreadnoughts to the tow cables. We're going to drag them with us." "Where are we dragging them to, Commander?" Elias asked, his organic eye locking onto Dean's. "Deeper in," Dean replied, pointing a finger at the star map projecting above the table. He pointed past the border worlds, past the agricultural colonies, straight into the glowing, dense cluster of the Council's inner sectors. "They want to treat our lives as a localized math problem. We're going to take this war to their core worlds. We're going to show them what an infestation actually looks like." Elias grinned, a terrifying stretch of scarred tissue. "Spooling drives, engaging tow tethers. The fleet is ready to jump on your mark." "Stand by," Dean said. "I need a minute." He left the bridge without another word. The corridors of the Goliath were dim, illuminated only by the sickly red glow of emergency lighting. Crew members scrambled past him, dragging heavy power cables and carrying makeshift stretchers. Nobody saluted. Nobody cheered. They just moved with the grim, mechanical efficiency of the dead. Dean walked down into the bowels of the ship, deep into the reinforced medical bay. The room was freezing. The antiseptic fog still clung to the floor tiles, swirling around his boots as he approached the solitary stasis pod in the center of the room. The frost on the glass had thickened, but he could still see the boy. Leo Davies, 8 years old. The yellow jacket was frozen stiff, the blood and mud locked into a suspended state of permanent violence. Dean placed a heavy, calloused hand flat against the freezing glass. The cold bit into his skin, a sharp, grounding pain. He didn't feel like a savior. He felt like a monster who had just unlocked the cage for humanity's darkest instincts. He knew they were going to do terrible things in the weeks and months to come. They were going to bomb pristine cities, shatter orbital habitats, and kill thousands of aliens who had never even heard of a human being. They were going to become the nightmare the Council always accused them of being. "I'm sorry," Dean whispered to the frozen child. "I'm sorry we couldn't just be better." He stood there for a long moment, listening to the heavy, struggling heartbeat of the dreadnought around him. He felt the ship lurch as the tow tethers engaged, dragging the dead weight of their fallen comrades into formation. He pulled his hand away from the glass. The condensation left a perfect, brief handprint that quickly faded back into white frost. Dean turned his back on the pod and walked out of the medical bay. He didn't look back. There was no time for grief anymore. There was only the momentum of the strike, the absolute necessity of pushing forward until there was nothing left to burn. He keyed his shoulder comms as he walked back toward the elevator, the heavy metal doors sliding shut behind him. "Elias," Dean said, his voice echoing in the empty corridor. It was entirely devoid of hesitation. "Take us into the dark. Jump." The ship shuddered, the reality around them tearing open once more, as Earth's dead fleet vanished into the void, carrying their ruined humanity straight to the heart of the galaxy. Did this gritty journey into humanity's breaking point keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved this dark, unapologetic take on HFY science fiction, hit that like button and share the video with fellow sci-fi fans. Your support helps fuel the channel and brings more intense, grounded stories to life. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below with your favorite moment or what alien faction Earth should crush next. Stay safe out there in the void, and we will see you in the next one.